welcome to Christian Answers. Good to have you along for the journey today. This is Jeff Short, and today we're going to be talking about the topic of the coronavirus in light of church services. The question is, should churches close their doors in order to prevent the widespread problems with coronavirus? We're having state governments advise, and not just advise, just tell the people in the church that the pastors especially, that they should not try to meet on Sunday mornings in groups, because what will happen is that who knows who has the coronavirus. You don't have to necessarily show symptoms of the coronavirus, and you can be a carrier of it. You can spread it to people in the congregation, and then they can take it home, and it spreads like wildfire through the community. So the state, the governors and state health officials in most states now are telling people that they cannot get together and gather in groups of, say, over 25 or 50 people. And what that means is Sunday mornings, church services, the average church, I think, has maybe 60 to 75 members. And so if you have 65 or 75 people gathering on Sunday, that usually would be in violation of the state health codes during this emergency time. A lot of states have declared state of emergencies. And so there is a fear that if this isn't stopped right away, it could get worse, and there would be problems with the healthcare system. They wouldn't be able to handle it with hospitals, beds, and medicine and test kits and also sorts of things. So the question is, should churches cancel their services? We've already gotten through 1 week of this where most churches around the area that I know of here in New York, upstate New York, have canceled their services. I was walking by a church on Saturday, a large downtown church, and sure enough, it said a sign right on the side of the door that says, quote, "Our bishop says that we should not meet, and so we will not be meeting until," I think they postponed church until the Easter week, which is, we're talking about 3 or 4 weeks. So this church in particular, a large downtown, in this case was an Anglican church, Episcopal church, would not even be meeting for 3 or 4 weeks. And they don't have an online presence. They don't have a webcast that they can actually show to the people in their homes. Now, some churches have been going online, Facebook Live, or broadcasting over their own website, and they have been having services with just the pastor and maybe a choir member or two to provide music. And they've had a church service online for the congregation, those that can access the internet, and that is what they've been doing. For example, the large Northridge Church in Plymouth, Michigan, my original hometown state, they have canceled their services, postponed them, they called it, indefinitely until they find out what's going to happen with this virus. And that church regularly, on a regular weekly basis, gathered over 10,000 people every Sunday. And so obviously they were concerned about gathering that large a crowd together, actually spread out over three or four services. So you have a few thousand in each service. But they were concerned about spreading the virus, so they canceled their services indefinitely until they can determine what is and what isn't appropriate. And they had the pastor on Sunday morning give talks, his regular sermon, and they had a worship band there, and they went ahead and did the service, but there were only a few people in the whole huge auditorium, and the service was being streamed live over the internet. So I don't know how many people tuned in live. I don't know how many people have actually watched the services after they were done. They're posted online, so people can, in real time, go to the website and watch the service. So I don't know how many people took advantage of that, but there are a lot of churches that don't have that video capability, and so they have just had to shut the doors. Now, the question is, as Christians, should we close the doors of the church for a crisis like this? Now, some Christians have been very vocal about not closing the doors of the church, especially in Roman Catholic Church membership. I've heard a lot of criticism of the churches in Rome, for example, and Rome is part of Italy, and Italy has had a terrible dealing with the coronavirus. Italy is one of the epicenters of the entire world as far as the coronavirus. They have been caught with practically no safeguards as far as blocking this coronavirus, and their entire country now is on lockdown. This is really a serious thing in Italy. Well, at first, many of the bishops ordered decrees that all of the churches would be closed down. The members of the Roman Catholic Church in Italy began to grumble and complain, and the outcry was so great that the Pope himself, the Bishop of Rome, finally had to say it's up to the individual churches and the priests, the parish priests, as to whether they're going to shut the church down on Sunday or not. And so some churches did, in fact, have their churches open on Sunday morning in Italy to provide a place for people who are scared and are tempted to panic and who want spiritual substance and encouragement at this time. And then others, I think most of them, were not open so as to prevent any spread of the coronavirus. I know here in the United States, in New York State, Western New York, I attended service last Sunday, and there was no closed church. And people were very careful not to shake hands, and they were very careful not to hug each other or greet each other or get very close to one another. I think we all tried to stay outside of 5 or 6 feet of each other, and no touching or even patting on the back or anything. Now, we did take an offering, and money was put in the collection plate. Some churches, I knew the week before, some churches did not take up a collection because they didn't want any of that money to be contaminated, and then the people that counted the money would therefore get the coronavirus and so forth. So they had boxes that people on the way in or out could put their weekly offering. So there are all kinds of different solutions that churches are trying right now, and there really isn't one size-fits-all policy for all churches. But we want to talk about today what is at stake here when the government issues a health advisory and decree. And we're also going to look at an article that was put out by the Nine Marks Ministry, and that is in Washington, D.C., and it's written by someone in that church. It's Caleb Morrill, and he is a pastor assistant at Capitol Hill Baptist Church, and he is part of the ministry there, and he put out a good article outlining what the churches in the United States did in the D.C. area, District of Columbia area, in respect to the Spanish flu, the Spanish outbreak, right after World War I. If you recall, this was the biggest pandemic that the United States has ever faced and the world has ever faced in the last 100 or so years. And this Spanish flu actually devastated the entire civilized world because of its death count. I mean, millions and millions of people died from the Spanish flu. Now, thank the Lord, coronavirus is not as lethal as the Spanish flu was. But it's instructive to see what the churches did in the D.C. area and what the government health inspectors wanted to be done, and how that negotiation took place as to should you leave the churches open, should you close the churches. and so on and so forth. And so we'll look at that first. But I want to outline some of the questions that come up when we're dealing with this coronavirus in respect to church services. So we're gonna deal with some of these questions today. We're not going to answer all the questions, obviously, but we want to open up some of the issues that are involved. Now, for some people, it's really straightforward, but I think that they're missing some important points. And some people say, well, the state has issued a decree that there shall be no gatherings of over 50 people or gatherings of over 25 people, and therefore the churches actually don't have any choice. They have to follow the state. When the state says that we're closing down assemblies of over 25 or 50 people, that means that churches need to comply. And they just say it's a no-brainer. We don't even have a choice. We have to follow along with the state. Well, what they're failing to grapple with is that this is raising an issue of the separation of church and state. This is raising a religious liberty issue. Does the United States government nationally, or do local state governments, do they have the constitutional right to tell churches they cannot assemble on Sunday morning worship? Is that the place of the state? And one of the interesting things that was done in the pandemic of the Spanish flu a long time ago, we're talking over 100 years ago, was that the health officials in Washington, D.C. did not tell the churches and the pastors and the congregations, they did not order the congregations not to meet. Very important here. So let's look. I want to go to an article here, and we're going to look at this article, and I'm going to bring this up, and we're going to see how they grappled with this problem, and then we're going to see how this applies to the churches today. So here is the article. It's called How DC Churches Responded When the Government Banned Public Gatherings During the Spanish Flu, and it's by Caleb Morrill, and he is a pastor there at Capitol Hill Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. Now, it's really instructive. I'm not going to read the whole article, but it talks about as World War I was coming to a close, still another enemy was making its way toward the nation's capital, the Spanish flu. Between October 1918 and February 1919, an estimated 50,000 cases were reported in the District of Columbia. 3,000 D.C. residents lost their lives. So this is a huge epidemic there, and it was a very deadly one. At the peak of the pandemic, the D.C. government banned all public gatherings, including churches. How Christians responded provides some lessons and principles for responding to similar dilemma in our own day. So it's very interesting. So and I'm not going to read the whole article because we don't have time for that today, but what I want to say is that the public health officials requested that the churches not meet. And they requested that they would not meet for a indefinite period of time. They didn't have a time limit, but they wanted the churches to not meet so that this pandemic could be stopped. And what happened was the area pastors gathered together into the ministerial association. They got together and they voted in order to follow the government's request. Now, this is very, very important. The government did not come into the churches of Washington, D.C. and say, you must, by decree of the President of the United States or by the health director of the United States, you must close your doors and you cannot meet. They didn't do that. Why didn't they do that? Because of separation of church and state and because of religious liberties. The church has its function in society, and government has its function in society. And you can't have the government just imposing itself on religious worship, especially. I mean, we're talking today, we have religious liberty issues. We're talking about people with consciences formed by their Christian faith, and we're grappling now with secular society trying to eliminate religious liberties in favor of the secular agenda. But even the most ardent secular activist says that churches can do whatever they want to do within the four walls of their church. Okay, we don't subscribe to that philosophy. We believe that our religious liberty extend beyond the walls of the church to our life and our speech and the way we raise our children and all of these other issues. But at least we have, no one questions religious liberty to worship the Lord in any way we want to within the confines of the church. Now, when you have a decree from the United States government or even a state government saying you cannot meet on Sunday morning and pray and worship God and open the Word of God and fellowship, you can't do that because of health concerns, that raises an entirely huge religious liberty issue. Well, the pastors of Washington, D.C., way back 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, gathered together and they voted to, yes, indeed, follow the request. It wasn't an order, it was a request. They will follow the request and postpone their church services until a sufficient time has passed and the epidemic has passed over. And so that's what happened. And there were some pastors. Now, the actual request says that they should cancel or postpone services indoors because, of course, obviously most people, when they go to church, they're going indoors. It's not an outdoor service. So there were some pastors that said, okay, we'll follow the request from the government, yet we'll try to meet outside. So a few people tried to meet outside. Some pastors had their congregations meet outside, and then the government said, no, we actually were talking about all church gatherings, the gatherings of people, not just inside, but outside also. And most of the pastors, the overwhelmingly majority pastors, vast majority, complied with the government request. Very important. It was a request, and the pastors agreed, and the Christian congregations agreed. Now, after a time, though, after a time when it looks like the epidemic was waning and was passing, the pastors began to talk among themselves and say, it's about time that we begin to open up the churches. And this was a matter of months. And then they actually informed the government that they were going to be going back to regular services, and the government reluctantly, but they went ahead and said, we understand, and allowed that. So just because the government says to do something doesn't automatically right away mean that we have to comply to it. Now, we do have instructions in the book of Romans. The Apostle Paul says we are to obey the ruling authorities, obey the governing authorities. And we need to try to do that. And so today, I think that pastors and congregations should try to bend over backwards to try to follow the mandates and instructions and decrees of the civil governments, whether it's state or national. But that doesn't mean that the government can boss or command churches around. That's stepping over their role as rulers in society. And no state authority can actually tell Christians to not worship and go to church. We are actually commanded in the book of Hebrews, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves one with another. So we're commanded, we're told, we're instructed in the Bible to attend worship services. And so we don't have the option of just dismissing that. So we have to follow the Lord's command. But that doesn't mean that and temporarily we can't suspend services because we want to try to be accommodating to the government and the concerns of the government as far as the spreading of these viruses. But we do have to grapple with that issue. It isn't just a settled, done issue. Just because a governor of a state or the president of the United States or anyone in government at whatever level says you cannot meet on Sunday morning, that is not the final word on the subject. We have to think about these things and grapple with them, pray about them, and reflect on them. Now, I think pastors were wise to go along with the health advisories. I think that there are creative ways that they can temporarily accommodate the concerns, the health concerns in our society at this time. After all, we don't want to be a part of the problem with the coronavirus. We want to be part of the solution. So one of the things, for example, that was said at Northridge, and the pastor there said, was that he didn't want to think of himself as someone who might be contributing to the ill health and the sickness of anyone by inviting people to come to church and then they get sick and they eventually die, or someone in the family eventually dies because it was spread at the church service. He didn't want to imagine that happening. So he wanted to do everything he could. And I think that most pastors, especially large church pastors, I noticed that Willow Creek Community Church, they've been going through a lot of problems. This is the last thing they needed to deal with. They've been dealing with pastoral and internal problems at their church. But now on top of all that, they have to deal with the fact that their church can't even meet now on Sunday morning. But what they're all doing is going online. They're going to Facebook Live. They're going to their web page live. Now, it remains to be seen whether all of the people that attend the service are actually going to get on the internet. Some of the people probably are not. And also, there's the whole thing of giving. There's no doubt giving is going to drop at churches. All I can say is we need to pray for these church planters who are counting on the Easter service this year to be their church planting launch. And after thousands and thousands of dollars and many, many man hours of work, that's going to be frustrated because there are probably going to be problems with getting together even on Easter Sunday. So unfortunately, that's the reality. But we have to grapple with these issues. It's not cut and dry just because the government says that we can't meet. We have to think that through and pray that through. Now, there are different reasons why one should meet and why churches should not meet. And the thing about not meeting temporarily, I think, is the best policy. If it's known that this is only going to be a temporary thing for a few weeks or even a month, then I think as pastors we should do everything we can to accommodate the situation and not contribute to the coronavirus problem. It's an emergency situation. Many of the states have declared an emergency, a state emergency, and even the national government, it's a national emergency. So these are different times. These are strange times. I've never seen anything like this before in my whole life. And so we have to be creative. Going online, if churches can go online and broadcast their services where the pastor is giving his sermon and the congregation can tune in. Obviously, that's not a long-term solution. To have a TV pastor and a TV church and attend that way is not what the Bible outlines. And there are so many things lacking in that paradigm that we don't even have time to talk about that. But in a temporary situation, it can do a lot to help people, because we really do want to help people during this time. There are a lot of people are afraid. A lot of people are prone to panic. A lot of people are very uncertain. It's psychologically what we're going through as a country and a nation with this coronavirus and the world. This is the kind of thing that causes mental health issues. This is the kind of thing that causes psychological maladies that can actually lead to physical problems. All kinds of spiritual, emotional, psychological needs are being pushed up by this coronavirus. And so there are going to be deaths that occur in the community, and there needs to be a way of processing that. And we have the content and the tools for handling all of these problems, whether spiritual, psychological, physical. We have the wherewithal in the Bible. We have it within the Christian faith. And so we need to bring that content to people, but we have to do it in a way that it doesn't cause trouble for them long term because of getting this coronavirus. So churches have to be very, very creative with the understanding that this is only temporarily. This is only temporary. We are going to get through this, and then churches will be meeting again publicly and in gatherings. But during this temporary time, we have to be very creative. We have to think outside of the box and ask God to give us solutions to problems we've never even thought of before. And understand also that God is doing something with this coronavirus. He is bringing disruption to our society. He's bringing disruption not only to our society, but to our individual lives. I don't think anyone will be business as usual for a while. So we need to be praying and asking God to show us and give us wisdom in how to act and where to go and how to be cautious but not be panicked, and how to take precautions but not hoard resources that other people might need. All kinds of things we're going to be facing as far as work. If our company has laid us off, how are we going to make ends meet? This is a time when God is disrupting people, and it can be used greatly to bring about a spiritual revival in our own individual lives and even in society and the world. This may be a great time of spiritual harvest where many, many millions of people turn to the Lord and trust in Him with all their heart. And so we need to be open to that. And at the same time, we need to be praying and asking God how this problem of church services can be solved, because we want to get people into church and we want to get them worshiping God the way we're commanded to do that. So keep this in prayer, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.